Hello, this is Dr. Goroyani, and thanks for joining me. In this lecture, we will cover the chronological development of communities in the Greek world. The Greek peninsula was first inhabited in the Paleolithic, but in this lecture, we will pick up the development of these societies around the Bronze Age, when the first cities were established in various parts of the Aegean. It is unquestionable that the formation of these cities of the Aegean should be seen in the context of the wider Bronze Age world system that developed in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, that is, the empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. During the Bronze Age, circa 3000 BCE to 1200 BCE, two civilizations arose in the Aegean area, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Especially in the latter part of the period, the development of these polities and the exploits of their inhabitants were so epic and gave later ancient Greeks the heroic tales and the mythological stories that continue to be popular today. The earliest of the two civilizations emerged on Crete, and that this oblong island that sort of caps the Aegean on its south side. State-level societies with central administration and monumental buildings, such as the ones you see on the slide, that were often called palaces, emerged around 1900 BCE. And mind you, these are the earliest the state-level societies to emerge on the European continent. The Slavic civilization gave rise to stories like the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, as well as the Minoan thalassocracy that legendary King Minos managed to establish over the seas around Crete. As for the Mycenaean civilization, which sprang in mostly the southern part of the Greek peninsula, it bequeathed us with stories such as those of the legendary houses of Mycenae and Sparta, and of course the war on Troy, which is described by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But besides these very exciting stories, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans left us plenty of archaeological and some textual evidence that allows us to reconstruct their societies. These powerful and well-connected societies seem to experience trouble around 1200 BCE. If you would like to read all about the ins and outs of that collapse and that trouble, right, of that first world system, or one of the first world systems, my suggestion to you is to read Eric Klein's book called 1177 BCE. But here's the short version of that book. The Mycenaean palatial systems came under pressure. But of course, the Mycenaeans were not alone in this. There's evidence from a number of their neighbors in the Eastern Mediterranean, like the Hittites, various kingdoms in the so-called Syro-Palestinian coast, in Mesopotamia, and of course Egypt, that shows us that various processes were at work, processes that essentially destabilized the world system at the time and resulted in the collapse of many of these palatial systems. Back in Greece, after the collapse of the palaces, at first life went on without the tip of the social pyramid for a time, but it soon became evident that the changed circumstances were not conducive to continuous economic growth and, of course, population stability. During the 200 years that followed the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces, there's evidence for population decline and general economic depression, which has colored our perception of the period, which is sometimes called the Dark Age of Greece. During this time, the social and political structures that had supported the palaces dissolved. In a sense, from this ground zero of sorts, there emerged the city-state, the most iconic political unit of organization for ancient Greece. What is a city-state, you might ask? Well, it is a state which consists of the city proper, that is the area inside the walls of the city, and it's surrounded and surrounding agricultural catchment of dependent territory. A city-state, Greek style, had to have an acropolis. That is, acropolis actually means the edge or the highest point of the city. And because it was the highest point of the city, the Acropolis for the Greeks of the historical period is where their gods of the city were worshipped. The second feature of the polis is a gymnasium, where boys and men would practice sports the Greek way, i.e., in the nude, which is what gymnasium actually means. Chew on that. The third feature of the city was the agora, or the marketplace, where people would congregate for shopping, but also where civic functions happened. In other words, the agora was the heart of the city. There are many city states in world history, and not all of them are Greek. Take, for instance, Venice, which at one point in time ruled a large part of the Mediterranean from its vantage point in the Adriatic. City states were bodies of citizens, essentially, who recognized that they belong to the same polity or political associations as Aristotle will tell you. Coming back to our timeline, I have to say that exactly how this process played out still remains elusive in its details, but archaeologists and historians all agree that it was during these 400 years that succeeded the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces that the polis emerges. Around 1000 BCE, the demographic decline seems to end and population numbers start creeping up again. During this remarkable century that starts around 800 BCE, um, a century that actually is considered pivotal for a number of institutions and art forms that we associate in Greece. So during this century, communities experienced rapid demographic and economic growth, coupled with the revival of trade, also the formation of the polis that we mentioned earlier, the rise of the so-called Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, aka Hello Olympic Games, and the beginnings of monumental architecture again after the long hiatus of 4 centuries. As I mentioned a little while ago, it was probably demographic pressures and other issues that spurred the Greeks to venture outside of the Aegean. I have put a few arrows on this map to indicate the general directions of the phenomenon. But if you survey the coasts of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, you'll start noticing these yellow dots pretty much everywhere, except, of course, the Syro-Palestinian coasts and the coast of Egypt, which were the urbanized parts of the Mediterranean. Starting in the 8th century BCE, the Greeks start sending out colonizing expeditions, which essentially expand the Greek world. So from the 8th century and on, the Greek world is a geographical area that starts from the Straits of Gibraltar here and goes to the Black Sea. The Greeks will live for centuries after the 8th century in city-states that were separated by geography, history, politics, and cultural differences, of course. So the question is, what kept them all together? What made them identify as Greeks? And here, as part of this, the answer to this question, we have to mention the so-called Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, some of which you might have already heard of. The Pan-Hellenic sanctuary is a category of sanctuaries that were recognized as points of convergence in the landscape and gave Greek visitors from all over the Greek world a place to find other Greeks and figure out, I guess, what made them Greek as opposed to Persian, Etruscan, Egyptian, and so on. Olympia, the westernmost of them all, Delphi, the northernmost of them all, Isthmia, and Nemea. Olympia and Delphi were the major sanctuaries in this league, organizing games every 4 years, while Isthmia and Nemea were the minor ones with games every 2 years. All of these sanctuaries were organized in a circuit of sorts, the periodos, that lasted 4 years. Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries and sanctuaries in general became meeting points in the landscape at places of great investment of resources by individuals, collectivities, such as states. Signs of this investment are, of course, the temples that start popping up in various sanctuaries. And that is why earlier we said that the 8th century was the century that brings us the beginnings of monumental architecture. But let's move on. During the 7th century, trade intensifies, not only with the newly established colonies, but also with the neighbors in the Mediterranean, with which, of course, Greeks were always in contact. As a result of this increased interaction, contact, ideas, and fashions are transferred from the East back to the Greek cities, and they influence the ways that the Greeks do things. For instance, their ceramics, as you may observe in this slide, start being decorated in a style that is very much reminiscent of the ancient Near East. Greek architects and builders are inspired by the great Egyptian temples, and when asked to build a temple, they build them like the Egyptian ones, but different enough, though. And when the occasion arises for life size sculpture, again the inspiration comes from Egypt. The iconic type of sculpture for this period, the kouros, that is the young male, and the kore, the young female, are again reminiscent of Egyptian statues, as you can observe in this slide. But in Greece, the kouros is not a statue of a king, not a statue of an important official, but a statue of a young boy that becomes the tangible manifestation of perfection and excellence. And of course, sports are part of this entire equation since they played an active role in proving a personal excellence in Greek communities. In the following century, kuroi gained popularity, but now the latest fashion in pottery is a new style called black figure pottery. In this style of decorating ceramics, the figures are usually black on a red background. I said usually because, as you can observe in this slide, this applies only to males as opposed to females, which are portrayed in fairer skin tones. Make note of this style of pottery, as it was fashionable in the first half of the 6th century. Therefore, when you see it from now on, you can safely date the artifact to this period. During the second part of the century, and no doubt because of the proliferation of athletic competitions, i.e., occasions to observe the naked human body in motion, the representation of human form in stone becomes more naturalistic, i.e., a little more convincing. Another byproduct of the popularity of the games is that in this period we get the first inkling of a more concrete Hellenic cultural identity, which centered around three axes: Greek language, common religious beliefs, and customs. One of which, of course, is to practice athletics in the nude. Philosophy makes its appearance in this century too, with names like Pythagoras and Heraclitus, and while philosophers are pondering mathematics or the universe, the latest style in ceramics is the red figure, in which now the figures are red, standing out on a black background. Even though this change might sound as a no-brainer to us, it was nevertheless a major innovation which opened up new horizons for artists on the succeeding periods. Again, we archaeologists make such a fuss about ceramics because you find ceramics pretty much everywhere in the ancient world. Therefore, ceramics are a quick and dirty way to date deposits, activities, buildings, and figure out where you are in time in general. So the change from black figure to red figure happens around the turn of the century, and the new century brought pretty big changes. So the dawn of the new period, that brought in these big changes was called the classical period. The changes were mostly due to the equivalent of a world war in antiquity, the Persian Wars. At the time, the Persian Empire had conquered all the lands between modern day Iran and Egypt and Turkey. Some Greek cities were on the outskirts, the westernmost boundary of the empire, and sometimes the Greeks caused trouble. In order to secure the westernmost boundary of his empire, the Persian king Darius invaded Athens to punish the Athenians for meddling in his affairs. But the invasion was unsuccessful and started an episode of Greek history, the Persian Wars, which was recently portrayed in the 300 movies. In the battles of Thermopylae, first movie, Salamis, the second movie, and Plataea, the Greek alliance, because remember, there was no unified Greek state at the time. So the alliance of Greek armies fought the invading Persian armies of King Xerxes and pushed the Persians back east. Some aspects of Greek culture continued unabated, like the games, but in every other way, these wars were catalytic and affected every aspect of Greek culture, politics, and identity. In the aftermath of the victory, the city-states that were previously allied started siding with either the Athenians or the Spartans in a bitter rivalry which culminated in a war that lasted almost 30 years, the Peloponnesian War. Despite the relentless war efforts, this time is also a time of massive creative outburst. All the major plays that have survived the test of time, like Antigone of Sophocles or Lysistrata of Aristophanes, were performed for the first time during the 5th century in Athens. And Athens was all the birthplace of theater and democracy. The same city also pooled its resources and the resources of many of its allies, I might add, and built the Acropolis of Athens, giving the world probably the most iconic ancient Greek building, the Parthenon. From all of this, you might be tempted to conclude that Athens probably won the war with Sparta. Well, the Peloponnesian War, narrated through the words of the first bona fide Western historian, Thucydides, offers us valuable insight on the dangers that democracy harbors when people are carried away by populist leaders. Athens was defeated by Sparta and entered the new century, no longer the superpower that was before. Sparta, though, was not in a better position. The war left all parties weaker, and in the new century, the struggle for dominance was no longer a two-party game. Athens and Sparta were joined by Thebes and Corinth, other important Greek city-states, while another political power was rising in the north. Macedonia, or Macedon, had been on the rise for quite some time, and its King Philip of Macedon had decided to pacify and unify the warring southern Greeks before he embarked on his campaign against Persia, of course, to avenge the wounded Greek pride that suffered during the Persian invasion. That was a party line, anyway. The unification of Greece by Philip was achieved through peaceful, quote unquote, diplomatic, and not so peaceful means. The last cities that opposed Philip's vision were defeated in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, and soon after the unification of Greece became official with the foundation of a federation of Greek states called the League of Corinth 2 years later. Philip, though, never embarked on his campaign as he was assassinated. But he had paved the way for the campaign that was launched by his famous son, Alexander of Macedon, sometimes called Alexander the Great, who realized his father's dream with his conquest of the Persian Empire. But the men in this family do not live long to enjoy their accomplishments. After the conclusion of his campaign, Alexander dies in 323 BCE in Babylon after having changed the fates of a number of ethnic groups in this part of the world at the time. Alexander's death is a starting point for the next period of Greek history, the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic means Greekicizing. In this vast, multicultural, multi ethnic territory that was imperial before Alexander came into the scene, Greek culture becomes the dominant elite culture and language. This huge new empire gets divided into four large empires bequeathed to Alexander's generals, who install themselves at the helms of these empires and start dynasties. Their empires vie against each other for dominance, all the while Rome rises in the west. Rome succeeds in getting a foothold in the east and then starts conquering the Hellenistic kingdoms one by one. By the end of the second and beginning of the first century BCE, the conquest of Greece is complete, and Rome does not stop there. But before we get too ahead of ourselves with Rome, let me emphasize a couple of very important changes that happened during the Hellenistic period. As we said in the beginning of the lecture, the most iconic form of ancient Greek political organization was the city state, or the polis. The polis was a small but autonomous body of citizens who organized and ruled themselves. Well, during this period, the polis goes out of fashion and is supplanted by the empire. The average Greek citizen, especially in the new Hellenistic territories, is no longer a citizen of a small city state, but a citizen of a large empire, in which his distance from the decision making clusters has grown exponentially. Now he's a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan. In this very multi ethnic and multicultural imperial context, people live side by side, albeit not without conflict or inequalities, of course. However, the forced coexistence fosters syncretism, i.e., comparison and blending of different traditions, which gave rise to many art forms and one of the world religions today, that of Christianity. In the Hellenistic world, living as a Greek and doing things the Greek way was the most fashionable way, the way you had to follow if you wanted to get ahead in life. And going through life as a Greek involved, of course, the practice of Greek sports in the gymnasium, of course, in the nude. And by the way, gymnasia were built all over the newly conquered territories, and the popularity of sports grew exponentially. But let's focus our attention back to Rome, which, after successive conquests of other regions and some civil wars, became an empire. Its first emperor was Augustus, who inaugurated a period of peace and economic recovery. During this time of peace, Pax Romana, sports and entertainment continued to flourish and rise in popularity. For about 2 centuries, the Panhellenic Games become more popular and include even women athletes who had recently started participating in athletic competitions during the Hellenistic period. But Greek athletes were not all that there was in the world of Roman sports, nor were the most popular sports overall. Gladiatorial fights and chariot races steal the hearts of Roman sports fans who go to the Colosseum and the circus to behave like us. They were fans of particular professional athletes or teams and rooted for them till the bitter end. A critical juncture in the history of the Roman Empire and the ancient world at large was the conversion of the Roman Empire into a Christian empire. Christians had gone from being the weird new kids on the block, so to speak, to being persecuted and martyred in the amphitheaters around the empire, and ultimately to engulfing the empire and changing it radically. The crucial figure in the latter part of this process was the Emperor Constantine, whom you see in this sculpture on the slide. The emperor was convinced by his Christian mother Helen to convert to Christianity and hence change the course of the empire forever. The epilogue for most of these sports, save the chariot races, is written by the Christian emperor Theodosius II in 435 BCE. Theodosius outlaws the practice of pagan religions, which meant the cessation of all religious activities in the Greek sanctuaries, including the athletic competitions, which brings us to the end of the era of Greek and Roman sports and the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for your attention, and join me next time to explore the topic further.